Look at some aspects of colonial Mexican decorative arts. And I'm going to argue that there are some things that one can see in the decorative arts that may not be as clear or may not even exist in the more symbolic arts of painting and sculpture. So before we move on, let me just for a moment stay with the definition of the decorative arts, which are those things that are all around us as we live. They're the things we eat with. They are the things that decorate our walls. They are the things that we sit on. So the so-called decorative arts do have a functional component, unlike or not in the same way that painting and sculpture would. In fact, in that sense, the decorative arts adhere more to architecture in that they serve a very clear purpose in the everyday life of the people who construct it and who patronize it. But at the same time, they have symbolic and or intellectual aspects that are often extremely interesting to pursue. So the first theme we're going to talk about is the exchange between Asia and Europe via Mexico, as seen in a fine china plate. Now, you are wondering what could fine china have to do with colonial Mexico? And that's exactly the point. In fact, it had quite a lot to do with colonial Mexico. So on your left from the Metropolitan Museum, you see a very elegantly painted blue on white ceramic vase that in fact mimics an old gourd, the fruit of a gourd tree that was used for usually as a liquid container. And on your right, you see in Houston's Rienzi collection, you see an extremely elegant, lustrous, fine china plate that contains the arms of the city of Puebla, a great colonial city in the center of Mexico. Both of these are profoundly affected by the blue on white, very, very fine porcelain decoration and potting of Chinese porcelain wares during this period. And in fact, Mexicans had a profound and close experience with a lot of very fine Chinese material because of something called the Manila Galleon. The Manila Galleon would set sail from Acapulco, headed for Manila in the Philippines. This happened almost every year. And the voyage would then the ship would stop at Manila in the Philippines, and there it would both give orders and take on merchandise from China. This is where Chinese traders would meet the Spanish and Mexican clientele, and in fact other clientele as well who wanted to use the Spanish trade routes. The Manila Galleon would then go back to Acapulco, as you see in the upper left map there. It would cross the Tropic of Cancer and take the prevailing winds and currents and go back to Acapulco, where the shipment would be taken overland across the mountains to the map on your right, you see, to Veracruz, where it would leave Veracruz and eventually go to Spain. Now, during the transshipment across Mexico, many very fine Chinese pieces would simply stay. And the Mexican elite specifically, the elite in Mexico City and the surrounding cities, were extremely finely tuned to the great Chinese decorative arts traditions for this very reason. On the bottom you see not a European, but in fact a Filipino, Sino-Filipino take on the Manila galleon from the Codex Boxer at the bottom of this slide. So this is not just something that happened from time to time, or the odd plate ended up in the Mexican collection. Instead, the nobility of Mexico were systematic, great collectors of fine china. On your left, you see a Chinese export tureen for José de Galvez, who was the Marqués de Sonora and a very, very important political figure in Mexico. He later was the minister of the Indies. This piece is now in the Metropolitan Museum. It was a Chinese export ware that was delivered to him. We've already seen on your right the Chinese export ware that found its way to Puebla, that is now here in Houston. And just to give you some idea of the scale, the scope of this, I pull out an inventory published by Gustavo Curiel in a very, very fine catalog done for the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in the early 2000s, in which he noted that well over 300, in fact about 500 pieces of fine china. And this is fine porcelain from China. We're not talking about local variants or copies or anything like that. We're talking about pieces from China were in one person's collection, the Viceroy Antonio Maria de Bucareli y Usura, from the late 18th century. This is stunning, how much access they had to very fine china. And a lot of this china would have been on the same level as that you've already seen in this presentation. Now, there are other indications that the Mexican elite was profoundly influenced, profoundly struck by the richness of the objects they saw coming from the Orient. Perhaps the most striking example of that is the fashion for folding screens in Mexico. These were often called biombos in Mexican Spanish, which is simply a transformation of the Japanese word for these folding screens, which is biobu. So the biombo was, in many ways, at least the Mexicans thought of it, as a direct borrowing of an artistic form, of a decorative art form from the Orient. But instead of Oriental motifs, oftentimes the Mexican nobility would want either scenes of leisure and or important historical scenes to be depicted on these pieces, which were then put behind the women of the family as they entertained, and often became conversation pieces. Again, Gustavo Curiel, in his fantastic piece for the Viceregal Treasures catalog of the early 2000s in the Museum of Fine Arts, describes in detail how these parties would have used things like these screens for conversation and for legitimating the families that owned them. And of course, the Mexican elite were seeing screens coming from Japan, like the one you saw here, or similar screens coming from China. And as we see here, this is two sides of a single screen. And this is, on the bottom is the conquest of Mexico, and on the top is a map of Mexico City. This is in fact quite a well-known screen, a quite stunning screen, in which all sorts of conversations could take place about the capital on the top, or the history of Mexico, specifically the conquest, and who participated in the conquest. That was a matter of some import, of course, for the founding families of Mexico, of colonial Mexico. So I want to end with a discussion of really what are very fine stylistic distinctions between Mexican chairs and similar European chairs. Now that sounds a little esoteric, I know. On your left is a chair carved, made in Mexico a little after 1730. And on your right is a chair made in England, but for the Spanish market, interestingly enough, done in 1730 exactly. So these chairs are very closely contemporaneous. These were made at almost exactly the same time. And what I would like you to notice is that they are, in fact, very similar in form, but the chair, the Mexican chair, if you compare specific areas of the chair, the Mexican chair always takes the motifs to a much more intricate, virtuosic level. It's just more complicated. Every motif, every form that went into making the chair becomes more complicated in the hands of a great Mexican furniture maker than they do with what on your right, in comparison, looks a little stiff. The British chair looks a little plain. For example, take the center of the back of the chair in each case. And look at the larger forms of the British chair on your right. How the two scrolls end at the top, making a vase-like motif for the entire back of the chair. Whereas in the Mexican case, the scrolls get their own decorations and turn in on themselves and are simply more complicated. This you can see in every single element. For example, beside the central part of the back, you see the two long passages of thin wood that go from the sides of the back of the chair up to the top of the back. These are very similar in form. They both use a scroll form to hook into the center part of the back of the chair. But in the Mexican example on your left, you see how they've done all sorts of things as the form goes up to meet the top of the back. There are several different smaller elements that make that passage more complicated. This is typical of Mexican art in the 18th century in general, what we call the Mexican Baroque, and often it has an adjective attached to it, the exuberant Mexican Baroque. But there is a reason for that. It is not simply the case that Mexican artisans couldn't help themselves, or the Mexican art style simply became what it was as a fundamental or somehow id-like drive to become more and more complicated. Rather, I would argue, and many other scholars have argued, that this complicated Baroque style, this desire to further elaborate forms that were coming from Europe or that were related to Europe, is something that the Mexican elite specifically did to create its own artistic identity. And for example, this is the Cathedral of Mexico before you. The entire left portion of the facade, of the front of the church, is done largely in a fairly sober fairly plain style that we call Herrerian Baroque, that comes from Juan de Herrera, the architect of the Escorial Palace in Spain. That was the sort of, if not the model, it was the stylistic template for a lot of what was built in late 16th century Spain. And of course, this is exactly when the Cathedral of Mexico started to be built. And you can see from the Escorial here just how plain everything is. The columns of the lower portion of the facade, the engaged columns, in fact, are just incredibly monumental. You might even spy two people seated near a column towards the right-hand corner of the facade. And yet they have very, very little decoration. Everything is, again, sober. It's elegant, but it is, no one would call this exuberant, although they do call it Baroque for some reason. Now, in Mexico, this sober Baroque was completely rejected fairly early on for what became, in the later 17th century, a truly exuberant style that really attempted to create a living wall, a sort of living, breathing surface of incredibly complex decoration over the entire architectural fabric here. This is the famous Rosary Chapel, or Capilla del Rosario, in the Church of Santo Domingo in Puebla, dated about 1690. So that would be at the end of the 17th century. And this you can find in many, many places in Mexico. And in fact, even in the Cathedral of Mexico, the later decoration was much more complicated and nothing like the more sober, more somber Spanish styles that even at this time, even in 1750, would have held sway in Spain. In general, Spanish architectural decoration would not have been this complicated. It certainly would have used some of these motifs, and it too had developed from the Herrerian Baroque, but it simply was not, they did not employ the sort of horror vacui that where every surface is covered and the most decorative detail one can muster must be jammed in to every square inch of the surface. That is Mexican. That is what the elite really latched onto as their own style. And we see this not only in the Cathedral of Mexico, or not in these incredibly complicated chapels, but we see them throughout the 18th century in the center of Mexico. So, to wrap this up, I want you to come away with a couple of ideas. First of all, we can glean really interesting things by being attentive to details in the decorative arts. And I really just scratched the surface today. One of the things we can glean is the connections between these globalizing economies in Asia, in Mexico, and in Europe. They were all tied together by this incredible web of long-distance trade. And we see that, in fact, Asia coming to Mexico had a profound influence on the decorative arts that you see on your left. And on your right, I would like for you to come away with this idea that the motifs and the stylistic decisions made by these decorative artists in the 17th and especially in the 18th century in Mexico were not just slavish copies of Europe that somehow got out of control, but were in fact the way that, or one of the ways that the elite communicated their own uniqueness. The Mexican elite had a sense of self that was different from the Spanish for any number of reasons that we will talk about at length during the course of several other lectures in this class. But for now, it's important to realize that these decorative details were not meaningless. They had a lot to do with the way the Mexican elite were presenting themselves as somehow different from their Spanish relations.